lighthearted. The president was telling jokes. The president was teasing us. It was a social evening. And there were moments where it was entertaining and funny, and there were moments where we were able to do, we think, some good work for Canada.
We begin today with Donald Trump's tariff threat, which continues to loom large over Canada. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's surprise dinner with the incoming president was, as you just heard, lighthearted. But while that dinner may have been entertaining, the Canadian delegation returned with no guarantee this country will be spared from Trump's 25% tariff pledge. The president-elect's priority at the moment is the border, but as both Canadian and American politicians have observed, Canada's lagging contributions on defense will likely become a priority yet again for Trump. The Liberal government announced its new Arctic foreign policy this week. Will what was announced do anything to appease the incoming administration? Melanie Joly is Minister of Foreign Affairs. I spoke with her on Parliament Hill following the release of that policy. Hi, Minister. Good to see you.
Hi, good to see you, Russia.
I appreciate you making the time.
Thank you.
Russia now operates, I believe, a third more military bases in the Arctic than the U.S. and NATO combined. They have 8 submarines based in the Arctic that can launch long-range nuclear weapons. They've spent the last decade, as you know, building up their military capacity, in the Arctic. How long do you think it will take us to catch up?
I think we have some catch-up to do, but I think we're not alone. We're there also with allies, including the Americans, and also along with the Nordic 5, which are Sweden, Finland, Norway, Iceland, and Denmark. And now what is happening is we have Finland and Sweden that have joined NATO. So for a long, long time, Vashi, Canada had a position, along with all the Arctic states, the 8 of us, including Russia, that the Arctic needed to be a low-tension region. But what happened is when Russia invaded Ukraine, it decided to invest a lot in this war. And it, bit by bit, became much more reliant on China. And what we've seen now is in this partnership between China and Russia, Russia is now the junior partner. And it is allowing China to be even more in the Arctic. And you're seeing now military joint operations, Coast Guard operations. And it has been for a long, long time the aim of China to be able to have access to the Arctic and to be able to have access to the Arctic because of climate change. Arctic sea ice is melting, and it's the quickest way between Asia, and therefore China, and Europe. And so we have to reckon that reality. We have to change our perspective on the Arctic, and we need to invest more in defense.
Do you think, though, that the policy you tabled today, which is, my understanding, has about $34.7 million in funding attached to it, $7 million annually thereafter, meets the moment, though, as you describe it from a defense and security perspective?
Well, of course, it's not about defense and investment. You have to read this new Arctic foreign policy as a bedrock for defense policy because, as you know, diplomacy and defense go hand in hand. And so what we did last spring was that the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense announced a very important defense policy update, investing billions of dollars in NORAD modernization, and also in equipment for the Arctic. It was the first time in decades that Canada was saying, we will invest even more in defense, but also while investing, we will prioritize the Arctic. And that's exactly what we're doing. And so, of course, you have to see the investments together.
Sure, but I have to challenge you even on that point, because in 2022, the first time that your government promised money for NORAD modernization as it relates to the Arctic, I believe the figure was something like $4.9 billion over 6 years. The bigger figure is $30 billion over the long term. So far, as of June, your government had only spent $70 million of that. How is that meeting the moment?
So I know that these questions would be best answered by the minister in charge of the file, which is the Minister of Defense. But what I can tell you is that we need to invest more in defense. And we know across NATO and across the alliance that we have an issue with the fact that our defense supply chains are not going fast enough. And a lot of the equipment that we're buying and all the resources that, the material resources that we're investing in are made in the US. And so we are having
that's
these
the only problem, though?
It's one of the main problems. It is one that, as an alliance, we're facing. because also, meanwhile, Russia has changed its economy for a war, to a war economy. But at the same time, we indeed need to do more, and we're doing more. So in order for us to have a common understanding of where we should invest, where is Canada's place in the world, what are the best way to protect Canadians on a military front and a security front, we need to have a foreign policy that is clear. And that's what I came up with today.
But you say how it's hand in hand with the defense policy. I've now covered 2 different defense policy updates that your government has provided. The primary criticism has been that you're promising to do things that never come to fruition. The former head of NORAD, just until this year, a retired U.S. General, Glenn Van Herk, upon the news of the stuff that you're highlighting, said, "I look forward to seeing those actions." But there's not a history of Canada taking those actions. Do you think our allies are convinced that your government will actually do what it's saying it will? Because you don't have a history of that.
Well, we have a history, actually, of making sure, as real Canadians, that when we say something, we do it. And at the same time, I think that we need to do more also to create a defense industry here in Canada. And that's what we're doing through the strategy and through also what we announced this summer, which was we will be in charge of producing the best icebreakers in the world. This announcement was made along the US and along Finland, because Davie Shipyard in Quebec City, which basically produce icebreakers for Canada, has just bought a Finnish shipyard from what used to be a Russian company, which was sanctioned and therefore prohibited to invest in Finland. And now Davie is looking at investing also in many shipyards in the US. And we know that we have catching up to do. We know that there are more icebreakers that are being built in Russia and China. But this is something that the Biden administration was looking at, and also this is something that the Trump administration and President-elect Trump himself has raised many times. So I think that we're actually in solution mode. I think we're creating good jobs at home, but I think also we have to do more of that in our country.
How do you, address, though, the sentiment as it has been expressed publicly from our allies, primarily in the United States but elsewhere? I spoke to the ambassador, David Cohen, the outgoing ambassador, who said our record on defense spending, and I take your point that the minister is responsible for that, but your portfolios are very intertwined. Our laggard spending has impacted our place in the world. Like, how do you convince allies that you're serious about what you're saying today? And do you understand how they might not believe it?
No, I think they do believe it. And I think that we absolutely need to do more on defense. And I've been saying that in all your questions you're asking. And I'm hawkish about that. I really think that the geopolitical reality has changed. We live in a tough world, and we have to be tougher in our response, period.
You mentioned the incoming Trump administration, and I wondered if you had the opportunity since Donald Trump announced his nominee for Secretary of State would be Senator Marco Rubio, to speak to Senator Rubio.
So I've been in contact with many U.S. lawmakers, but as you know, confirmation hearings are happening soon, and the Secretary of State is not necessarily engaging with any foreign ministers. But I've been in contact with many senators that know him well, and my goal is definitely to be able to have different conversations with people around him. Of course, you don't want the foreign minister from Canada to be a problem for the confirmation of the new Secretary of State.
Do you have an impression, based on those conversations, of whether or not we will avoid the application of those tariffs?
I think that when President Trump talks about tariffs, we have to take him extremely seriously. And I think we have to be ready with our own tools. And at the same time, we have to develop our relationships with the incoming administration. And that's exactly why Prime Minister Trudeau went to Mar-a-Lago.
I wanted to ask in that vein, like, if a 25% tariff is applied to our imports, which essentially sends our economy immediately into a recession, how eager are you to strike that allyship with the U.S., to foster that allyship? Like, isn't it a direct insult?
Well, see, I've been to Washington recently. I've had many phone calls with many American senators. I think that there is a reckoning that not only are we an important partner, but Canada is the biggest export market for the U.S. Anything they do in terms of their economic policy will have, when it comes to our relationship, will have an impact on them too. And that's why we have a very successful trade partnership. And at the same time, when you look at it, the trade numbers are more than China, the UK, and Japan together. So,
but you've been making that, you and your cabinet colleagues have been making that argument since last January to the people in and around Donald Trump, and you were not able to secure any kind of exemption from the threat of the application of these tariffs. What does that say?
Well, first and foremost, the president will be inaugurated on January 20th. I know that there's lots of concerns across the country, but at the same time, we're doing the work. We had a plan from the get-go because we've been working on different scenarios. We're now implementing that plan. And the plan was to create this U.S.-Canada committee, was to engage rapidly by going to Mar-a-Lago, making sure we were creating good relationships. And my job in that plan was also to work with other countries in the world and to make sure that we would be working with our European allies and our North Pacific allies. And I've been doing that work.
Is anyone going to defend us?
I think that we have very good relationships, and I think that we can definitely work with many countries. But I think that many countries are coming to see us to understand how is Donald Trump, how is his future administration, and just overall U.S. dynamics.
Does that do you think that resonates with Canadians when they see on the face of it that he is threatening to essentially destroy our economy? That does it make sense to Canadians that other countries would come to us for advice? Like, it doesn't seem like things are going well.
Well, I think that every country on earth is asking itself, how will the U.S. administration behave?
But he's picked two to take aim at, right? Us and Mexico.
No, I don't agree. He's picked China. And I think that what is clear with this U.S. administration is how much the competition between China and the U.S. will be at the core of their administration. And that is the fundamental change that is coming in geopolitics.
One final question for you on your leadership, which I know you've already talked about this week because of the New York Times article. I just want to get you on the record. If the Prime Minister were to step aside, have you ruled out running to replace him?
This isn't a political question. What I can tell you is right now the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister. He's going to be the candidate for the next elections. And I'm 100% supporting him. And I've been supporting him from the get-go when he decided as a young MP to become the leader of the Liberal Party since 2012. So I'll continue to do that.
Is it fair to say you don't have leadership aspirations?
I'm saying that my goal is to get reelected in the next election and to be representing Huntsville. And I think that is a prerequisite to any other political engagement.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. Minister, thank you very much. I appreciate you making the time.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.